We're nowhere near, we're not on track. We've got 2 billion people living without access to clean water. That's 1 in 4 people still living without access to clean water. And in terms of people's time, it's largely women and girls who are spending 200 million hours every day walking miles for water. We believe every single person, everyone deserves access to water, and that water should be sustainable, so it should last forever.
Welcome to Liquid Assets, where we talk about the intersection of policy, management, and business, all as it relates to the world of water. Today, we have an awesome guest for you from Water for People, Katherine Williford.
Hi, my name is Katherine Williford. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Water for People. Water for People works across 9 countries to end water poverty.
Katherine, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Robbie?
I am doing good. Before we hit the record button, we were talking about the urgency of it all. I'm just going to say that. Let's just jump into that. What do you mean? What the urgency of what? What are you talking about?
Yeah, so, the Sustainable Development Goals were set back in 2015. And in terms of water, that means reaching universal access by 2030. We're nowhere near, we're not on track. We've got 2 billion people living without access to clean water. And we've got a long way to go. And we're seeing that investments across philanthropy, government, business are just not keeping up with the need. And people's lives are at stake.
Let's kind of jump into the SDGs really quick. What does universal access by 2030 actually mean? Like, does that mean that everybody has access to, is it like so many cups of water per day? Let's just kind of dig into that. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so it's about, a certain distance that you do or do not have to walk for water, and about the quality and consistency of that water. So, of course, here in the United States, for us, that means turning on a tap in our home. But in Malawi, that might mean walking to a community tap stand and being able to know that the water will flow every time you access it.
Yeah. And the water obviously need to be clean too, right?
Yes.
You can actually go and, you'd have to walk to go get the water, but then obviously you don't want to be drinking dirty water even when you get there.
Yes.
How far are we, right? They said that we should have universal access by 2030. You say that we're really far. How far exactly is that?
We've got 2 billion people to go. So 2 billion people, that's 1 in 4 people still living without access to clean water. And in terms of people's time, that's largely women and girls who are spending 200 million hours every day walking miles for water.
That's such a staggering number. 25% of the world's population still doesn't have
I should double check
access.
the world's population, but I think that's right. Yeah.
Sure. I think it's like, between 8 and 9 billion people.
Yeah.
And over 200 million hours are spent per year, per day. And the problem is that once they go and they usually have to walk to get to water. We don't have this kind of flush and forget sort of mentality.
Yep.
That even when they get there, the water sometimes is not clean. And I've heard this staggering statistic that actually the largest killer in the world is diarrhea and dysentery from dirty water. And so even if we do provide water, a lot of it's also not clean.
Yes, that's exactly right. And, often people are walking, 3-4 miles to get to a spring that is more consistently clean, but all it takes is one time. Also lack of access to safe bathrooms leads to, of course, poor sanitation, and you're more likely to have unclean water in those circumstances. And so it just compounds on itself.
Yeah. And so let's kind of jump into your work, because I think that's a perfect segue for what you do. How does you and your organization solve this? And if you can kind of just go a little bit into explaining what you do. You've been there for about 4 years. I won't kind of spill the beans, because I'd love for you to explain it.
Yeah, so I work at Water for People, and I lead our fundraising and communications efforts. It's our program colleagues around the world who do the really important stuff. Water for People had a real time of reckoning in about 2008, 2009, in that we looked around and saw that after millions of dollars invested by ourselves, but also by other NGOs and governments around the world, a huge percentage of pumps and pipes and wells were sitting like littered across different countries, just broken, not functional. And so there was this recognition that we were only doing maybe a quarter of the job by installing infrastructure in communities that were lacking access. That really what we needed to put in place were the systems around operation and maintenance, proper financing, good water policy. And that meant being there for the long term. And that meant making sure that the people in place doing this work were local. So we started what we call the everyone forever model, which means we believe every single person, everyone deserves access to water and that that water should be sustainable. So it should last forever. We now work across 9 countries and about 40 districts, have reached about 5 million people, partnering with government, local entrepreneurs, small business, community leaders to put in place these systems. And again, not just the infrastructure system, but all of those kind of surrounding mechanisms that we take for granted that allow water to continue flowing. And now, recognizing the enormity of the problem, we're working on partnering with national governments and subnational groups to try and scale this work to reach more than 200 million people by 2030.
Wow, that's awesome. And so right now, the big gap is from getting started 5 million to how many million are you looking to capture?
Yeah, so we've reached about 5 million people at the local level. And we think through national system strengthening that we can, again, through a systems change, system strengthening, collective impact approach, reach 200 million people.
200 million. That's amazing. And just to kind of backtrack and unpack, back to like first principles thinking of what's actually
Mhm.
happened, right? If I heard you say this correctly, we came in earlier and there was pumps and wells and pipes and infrastructure that was given through, I think, what
Mhm.
could be called early 1900s philanthropy of,
Yep.
we're just going to go ahead and throw a bunch of equipment out there and people will
Mhm.
figure out how to use it. We shortly figured out that everything's kind of scattered around and not being used. And if you then double click into kind of what gets people to actually make sure that they're maintaining, that they're using things properly around the kind of policies that you guys built, how does that work? Like what does that look like tactically outside of, working with governments? Do you find people in the local cities as you just mentioned? Is there like a training? Are these people part of Water for People? Like what does the actual infrastructure look like?
Yeah. So one of the cool things that struck me when I joined Water for People and visited with our program in Bolivia is that it's often difficult to tell who's a Water for People employee and who is a local district employee. And so
Mhm.
typically, if we've committed to working in a district, we're staying there for a long time, typically at least 10 years. And we're setting shared targets and goals in partnership with local government. And so then we're doing an assessment and seeing, what are all of the gaps? What are the things that we bring to the table? What are the resources that the government can bring to the table? Are there other NGOs in the area, donors, any kinds of local partners and stakeholders? Do that kind of baseline assessment and then kind of get to work. Every year we employ a monitoring approach and see how much progress did we make, what worked, what didn't work. And again, with 3 core goals, which is reaching every household, every school and clinic, and every community in that district with clean, flowing, sustainable water. And so it sounds simple, but committing ourselves to just measuring, is this working? And looking back at the indicators, sharing that transparently with all of the other stakeholders and making an agreement to make whatever adjustments and investments we need to make the following year has been very effective.
Super cool. And when you kind of go and you make sure that you hit these three pillars of every house, every school, every community, as you're going out there and you're working with the folks that could be Water for People or
Mhm.
in the local government, if just to kind of make it easier for like the layperson, if I was to like
Yeah.
make an analog to like a city government in the US, right? You guys would go into Phoenix, let's just name a
Mhm.
city. Phoenix will have the Phoenix water, the city water.
Yep.
Would you work with the Phoenix like mayor at that point in time and say, hey, look, you guys have a water problem. We're going to work with your water board and we're going to come in and put in these Water for People individuals that are funded by us and we'll help you work with policies. Like how does that work in this kind of Phoenix example?
Yeah, I love that example. So mayors are really important partners and stakeholders in this for us. Often when we're going into, a rural community in Bolivia, there's not a utility. There's not an equivalent to Phoenix water. There's nothing there. So a big part of what we do in that first year is actually create what we call a district wash office. So help
Hmm.
the government set up, what does this kind of function need to look like? What kind of skills do we need to hire for? Who do we put into place? And then once we've created that district wash office, again, which is owned wholly by the government, we can start providing technical assistance, co-investing on infrastructure investment, all of those pieces. But yeah, it's a really good point that even things we take for granted, like a utility, don't exist yet. And so that's a lot of what we work to help put in place too.
Ri- Awesome. And that kind of actually raises another question. As you help kind of build this, I'm going to put in quotes utility, right? Because it's kind of co-owned with the
Mhm.
government. What are our payment models? One of the actual, conversations we had earlier on the podcast was around water not being properly monetized, right? Like the value of water is kind of less than it should be. Is there digital finance? Like how does that work when you do set up the sort of infrastructure for the government to also recoup an ROI on this infrastructure investment?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in this area, but it is something that continues to be a challenge. And in some of the countries where we work, it's not only the kind of underpricing of water, it's also, that water is a human right. There shouldn't be a price on water. Might be a community belief, and so a lot of work is put into pricing out. Like, okay, then fine, we pay for the service associated with that water, and have created some tools ourselves and in partnership with IRC Wash, which is another NGO in the space, to help ourselves and governments understand not only what was the cost of, this might be a little jargony, but installing this infrastructure, but what's the cost over 20 years to repair, maintain it, replace it, and trying to build all of those pieces into what we consider the price of water to be. The other thing that we work really hard at in various contexts is kind of like blending different financial models so that, in rural areas where it's very expensive to get water to and probably will always be cost prohibitive, that we're, working with larger entities in the country to help set tariffs in the city that might subsidize water in the rural area, for example.
Got it. And what kind of comes to mind too, especially in working with local governments, is just this jurisdictional approach will always
Mhm.
have various, I mean, you have a large diversity of needs, wants. You have different corporations that may have agricultural offerings that are taking up a lot of water.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
what does that look like when you come in and kind of survey a region or a district or a jurisdiction? Because from going up to 200 million people, obviously you're tackling a lot of small fragmentation, and a lot of different places that speak a lot of different languages, a lot of different cultures. What does that kind of look like?
Yeah, for us, it's just all about bringing those different stakeholders to the table. So, if we're operating, we more frequently than not are operating in rural contexts. So agriculture is a big factor in a lot of places where we're working, and we'll, partner with landholders to come up with some sort of dynamic arrangement where, let's say, the whole community agrees, we're going to each put in a small amount of funding to fund this water system. It might be that an agricultural landholder says, I'll donate the land for this, or I'll share the land for this. Again, trying as best we can to put in place kind of win-win models because, as you said, everyone benefits from water access, but it is unequally used.
Yeah, yeah. I always like to figure out kind of what makes our guests tick. Why do you do this, Catherine?
I am really passionate about ending poverty. Really spent time in Honduras when I was much younger, seeing the impact of malnutrition, lack of access to water, lack of access to healthcare, and just how deeply it hurts people and, stifles all of our ability to grow. And so really passionate specifically about the way in which water for people unlocks the potential of families, communities, countries, and hopefully leads to a more just world in the end.
And how did you get into that? Did you get sent on a trip through school, or were you volunteering at a nonprofit or working for one? What was the
Yes,
what was the story there?
I was a teenager. I went on a community service trip to Honduras with my classmates. And I realized that I was really stressed about things that were pretty silly in the context of the poverty that I was seeing in real time. And so I, took a year off, did a gap year, moved to Honduras, continued volunteering with that nonprofit, and then have been working in various nonprofits ever since.
Awesome. And I always like to kind of go back one more step. Is there, I know the story is never straight, but if you look kind of
Mhm.
hindsight 2020, is there a through line in when you were at home or you're being raised that you were just kind of like, oh, this particular thing actually impacted me in this way to now get into what I do today? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I mean, I think it was that specific trip, right? And then specific for fundraising and communications was kind of recognizing early in my career that even as I wanted to be the person that was really good at solving these problems, I was actually better at talking about them and sharing the passion with others. And so I'm glad that I had that reflection early on and have come to really love the opportunity to connect with supporters and, people who are just learning about this for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, totally makes sense. Storytelling actually comes up a lot in the podcast, and the fact that water really has a messaging problem. With
Yes.
you kind of being where you're at, and if you were to kind of talk about that, what what do you think is a manifesto? First of all, I guess, what do you think? I guess you agree that the problem in water is obviously messaging a problem, but what solutions do you think there are if we were to just brainstorm live here?
I mean, if we had solved them, we would be really much further along than we are. So I think, one of the problems is that people thinking of water access think of it as really far away. That's a problem over there.
Mm.
Another problem is that we'll have some donors think it's solvable, or it's not something for me to step in and work on. And it's there's a lot of competition, right, with other causes, health, vaccines, education, climate justice. It's not a competition. All of these things are really important, but we find that because water is a need day in and day out, and we take it for granted if we're living here in the US, that it becomes kind of taken for granted in the philanthropic conversation as well. Not to mention, I mean, it's really interesting to learn all of the conversations in business around water usage and water scarcity and climate change. I think that maybe I'm just coming up with problems, but I think that's one of the biggest problems, as I go to conferences or talk to different partners about water. We're not even speaking the same language to ourselves. Those of us working in water and sanitation and health are always talking about it a certain way. I go to a conference where businesses are meeting about this. They're talking about volumetric accounting. They're talking about all of these other things, social co-benefits, which I imagine we can find a through line to. But even amongst ourselves, we've really become hyper focused through our own lens. And so then it's no surprise that the general public is like, well, this sounds like 10 topics, not one topic. So I would say I don't have the solution yet, but I was excited. Our Runway for Water campaign was just kind of one attempt to break through and kind of bring the need and the cause to new audiences in a new way. And it'll take, a lot more of that from all of us to really break through.
And what's the Runway and Water campaign?
Yes. So the Runway for Water campaign is a campaign that Water for People launched earlier this month, aligning with New York Fashion Week. And so we've filmed several community members in Chikoldara, India, all women who walk for water every day. They wore their most beautiful traditional Indian
Mhm.
clothes and made the walk for water and kind of overlaid it with techno music, basically music you might hear at a fashion show, and just really tried to show the contrast between, well, we're all focused on New York Fashion Week or Milan Fashion Week, which is exciting and fun to watch. There's also this really serious walk that's going on every day that is going unseen.
Wow, that's really provocative and profound. I actually love that. We'll have to post that in the show notes.
Yes, for
Link
sure.
to that. Definitely.
Thank you.
What does technology look like in when you guys go and actually deploy these infrastructure projects, all the way from kind of, as you mentioned, starting up a utility, again in quotes, all the way
Mhm.
to kind of making sure that you're monitoring and measuring properly? Because you did mention at the beginning of
Yeah.
the episode that
Mhm.
monitoring is a really big concern of yours. and the organization. And so what does technology kind of look like within that sphere?
Yeah, so technology for us, our technology policy is that we need it to be locally available and affordable in the communities where we work. So a lot of times, we'll have well-intentioned companies that have a new exciting technology that they're wondering could they donate? Maybe it would, work for a particular system. But kind of based on that experience in the 1990s that I talked about, we know that if we bring that in one time, leave it, and there's no supply chain to bring it back to Uganda, it's actually not a help. It would be better to have a hand pump that's reliable, for example. And so a lot of our technology is still pretty simple. I mean, we have gravity fed systems, which for listeners is just kind of using the hilliness of some of the areas where we work to push water to different areas in the community. And as far as monitoring and evaluation, right now it's still pretty simple. We send out enumerators who are going and doing surveys, but I have been really interested to learn about how some other like health nonprofits are using iPads, for example, to go
Mm,
out and gather and like report out that data more efficiently and effectively. But again, if you're working in a community where the average income is less than $5 a month, technology is difficult to access in a way that's sustainable.
totally makes sense. And from a management and maintenance perspective too, the folks that are either water people, individuals, or local, are those being paid by the philanthropic dollars from Water for People, or are they raised via the local governments? I'm sure it's a hybrid, but like
Yeah.
how does that work? Because those people are now spending their time doing something that they otherwise wouldn't have been. And so how do they get compensated?
Yes, and I'm glad that you asked because they shouldn't do it for free. So a good example would be when I was in Zulu, Malawi, I got to visit with some really remote villages where they introduced me to their regional hand pump mechanic, who was a local gentleman who had been employed by the district to, go around, monitor and interview everyone. Is the system working? What repairs are needed? Go back around and, actually do those repairs for community members. Communities in that case are paying for specific repairs with, they have a community water fund that they all pay into a small amount each month. Then they pay this hand pump mechanic directly. In other instances, both with operation and maintenance roles and other kind of similar roles, we might co-finance a position like, 50-50 with local government for 4 years with the intention that by year 5, it can be fully funded by the government, things like that, so that it's not, all on government all at once because we're right there alongside them, but also so that they're getting used to that cost and that it's built into everything so that it's sustainable if and when we're no longer there.
Hmm. Yeah. Let's kind of pivot a little bit into what you do on your kind of day to day. As I mentioned, obviously messaging has been, a big problem in the water industry, and that's kind of a lot of your job. Walk us through like the nitty gritty, maybe even like a case study of what you've seen that works, doesn't work, and maybe if you can kind of talk a little bit about what your day to day looks like.
Yeah. So let's see. I oversee both fundraising and communications at Water for People.
What else needs to come in? What other governments, what other people, organizations, maybe even ones that don't exist yet? If you were to have a magic wand, how would you fill that gap?
Yeah. So one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet, but that I'm really excited about is that Water for People co-founded the Destination 2030 Alliance with IRC Wash, and now Water for Good has joined as well. And kind of under that alliance, among other things, we've set these 3 strategic targets. So 200 million people reached nationally, but also how can we contribute to the global conversation and global investment choices so that those 2 billion people are reached by the end of 2030. I mean, I think that 2 billion number requires not only increased investment from places like national governments, the African Development Bank, UN entities, USAID, philanthropy. It's also like presidential voices talking about this, making, high level commitments. Katerina de Albuquerque of SWA said at an event a couple of months ago, that when President Roosevelt, I think that was who, I'm going to get it messed up. But anyway, he made the goal like, we're going to send someone to the moon in 7 years and we just have to do it. And there is something powerful there with somebody with enough influence and, soft power saying, no, enough is enough. We've got to do this. So I think, Water for People, IRC, Water for Good, other NGOs, we've got a really important role to play in elevating this need and helping put the pieces together, but it'll really take, grassroots and grass tops push at the same time to reach those 2 billion. And it's coming quickly.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I love how you say grassroots and grass tops. I've actually never heard of that phrase
Mhm.
before.
Mhm. Mhm. Need both.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Awesome. If you were to encourage the audience to make one move today, what would you tell them? And if alongside a point two, I love to ask this question of like, what's something that you know that the audience doesn't know? Because there's
Mhm.
always these like little niches in each of our jobs that you
Mhm.
you deal with every day, and the rest of the world kind of doesn't know that.
Let's see. So certainly you can go to waterforpeople.org and sign up for our emails. We'll send out calls to action. Of course, there's opportunities to donate, to, sponsor a race. There's, a million different ways you can support with your voice or with your dollars. And also just kind of curating your social media feed. We learn about what we decide to learn about. We've filtered ourselves really highly these days. And so not just Water for People, but just, other kind of internationally focused organizations on water and other causes, health, just being globally aware, I think is a really important and helpful move for all of us. And something that I know, I think the thing that I've been most struck by during my time working with Water for People is, again, that intersection between women and girls and water. And so we already talked about the 200 million hours lost each day, but it's also like gender-based violence, unwanted pregnancy, all these things that are in the news around women's rights. If you're really passionate about those things, you're actually really passionate about ending the walk for water too. So that would be my nugget that has been, a really important learning for me over the past couple of years.
Totally. Sense. If you were to have a handful of actionable handles or even names, I'm sure people
Ooh,
can search on Instagram for those handles. Like, what's three? I mean, sometimes I'm like listening to a podcast and I'm
mm,
like immediately pull out my
mm.
phone and I'm like now subscribing to these things. So you said one is Water for People. Let's
Yes, one
get
is
let's get two more.
yeah. So IRC Wash, they are our partner in the alliance. Good. And then I would follow UN Water. They have really good content as well.
Awesome. I asked this question to everybody before we end the episode, and it's: is there a book, a TV show, or a movie that has had an outward effect on your life? Cause you to kind of change the way that you look at your world or potentially the world of water.
Yes, I think if any of my team ever listen to this, they'll laugh. I would say Brene Brown, Dare to Lead. I love all of her books, but particularly Dare to Lead has been really grounding and thinking about not only team leadership kind of internally at Water for People, but also how do we show up in the world? How do we have these conversations with leaders, supporters, donors, whoever it might be? She's got a lot of good nuggets in there. Mhm.
Awesome. We'll definitely add those to the show notes.
Awesome.
Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today. This was absolutely insightful.
Yeah, this was great, Robbie. Thank you for having me.
And for all of those of you out there, you can listen to us wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Google, which apparently now is actually being deprecated, and our Apple Podcasts or YouTube. You've been listening to Liquid Assets. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks.